The Businessin Wales podcast, the business media for Wales. Hello and welcome back to the Businessin Wales podcast with me, Daniel Bevan. Now, as you will be well aware, the Senedd election is less than a year away. So with that in mind, we've invited members from each of the major political parties in Wales to talk about what they want to do for business and the economy. I'm delighted to say that my guest today is a man who's not afraid to speak or indeed tweet his mind. Andrew RT Davies, former leader of the Welsh Conservatives, now chair of the Economy Committee in the Senedd. How are you doing?
Great, thanks Dan, and thanks for inviting us on. Really looking forward to it.
Not a problem at all. So talk us through what you're up to at the moment. As I say, now chairing one of the committees in the Senedd, but since stepping down from your post, how's life changed?
Well, it's allowed me to do a lot more on the family farm in the Vale of Glamorgan, which is my passion, and I'm lucky to be farming with my youngest brother and my two sons, so it's a family business it is. But also the politics, making sure that I am representing the area that I'm currently elected to represent, South Wales Central, which I'm sure many of your listeners are thinking, what the hell is that? For simple terms, it's Cardiff, the Vale of Glamorgan and the three valleys, Pontypridd, Cynon Valley and the Rhondda. And many might know, or they might not know, but all that electoral arithmetic goes out the window come 2026 because we get a whole pile of new constituencies. Because in their wisdom, Plaid and Labour decided to rip up the electoral map that everyone was familiar with, throw in an extra 36 politicians and ask the taxpayer to fund it to the tune of 120 million quid over the 4 to 5 year lifetime of the next Senedd. And so we will next time be fighting the constituency of Vale of Glamorgan and Bridgend when it comes to my nomination, because that's where I've been nominated to stand for the Welsh Conservatives. And I'm looking forward to getting on the campaign trail and following the door knockers and making sure that we can speak to as many people as possible.
Yeah, and of course, it is a very busy time for all politicians. We're starting to see policies coming out now from each of the major political parties, including your own. So let's, if you don't mind, we'll break down a few of the key policies. First of all, talking about business rates and income tax dropping. Now, it's an easy thing to say, but is this a funded tax cut?
Well, I'm not part of the shadow cabinet anymore, and colleagues in the shadow cabinet announced the income tax cut last week.
But you support it, presumably?
Oh, I'm a low tax conservative, but I'm obviously just making sure that your listeners understand from my perspective, I'm not part of the shadow cabinet.
Yes.
I look forward to making that offer to the electorate come the next Senedd election, because one thing we know is that people need to be able to spend their own money. They earn it, they should be able to keep it. And if this tax cut was to become a reality by people voting for the Welsh Conservatives, that would mean for the average couple £456 a year extra in their pay packets. That's real money that people can make a difference on. And as Conservatives, we believe that obviously the best people to spend their money are the people themselves. Although you need a reasonable level of taxation to obviously pay for our great public services, such as health, education, transport, environment, etc. And when you look at businesses in Wales, one of the things that really grates many businesses is obviously the business rate regime here in Wales, which charges businesses the highest rate of business rates of any part of the United Kingdom. And also, when you look at the multiplier with business rates, many small businesses are paying exactly the same amount of business rates as large superstores out of town shopping parks, such as Tesco's and any of the other big operators. That, to me, just doesn't seem fair. And in England, when we were in government in Westminster, we changed that multiplier to make it more advantageous to small businesses so that they could keep more of their money on their balance sheet rather than handing it over to the Exchequer. Because we know when businesses have money on their balance sheet, they employ people, they invest for the future, and they invest in research and development so that they're there at the cutting edge of technology. And that's why we want to get rid of business rates for most small businesses here in Wales and make us competitive again so that we can reinvigorate the Welsh economy.
So speaking specifically about income tax, and you look at the Welsh Health Service, and whilst waiting times have been going down, the Welsh Government are at pains to say that, clearly the level of service is not where people want it to be. Surely the only way that that's going to be fixed is by funding it, and you're presumably pushing for less money in the public sector overall.
Well, if the Welsh Government had listened to me some 4 years ago when I was imploring them to listen to the Royal College of Surgeons and bring in diagnostic hubs and surgical centres to get on top of the backlog that the NHS was building up here in Wales, to get us into the situation where we've got the worst waiting times of any country in the UK, then we wouldn't have that massive backlog now. And it's all well and good that ministers saying, waiting times are coming down. Don't forget that in a country of 3 million people, there is still nearly 20,000 people waiting 2 years or more, whereas in England, a country of nearly 60 million people, it's measured in the low hundreds, I think 160, 170 people, because they adopted surgical hubs and diagnostic centres. So you can keep funneling money into the NHS, or you can work creatively with the professionals in the NHS and change the way the service is delivered. Now, we want to see investment in the health service, but we also want to see change. And one of the big changes you can also make is funding primary care so that people aren't diverted into the acute sector for many minor procedures. Why should you have to go to your district general hospital to have a minor procedure that could be performed in your local GP surgery or some mid-tier community hospital, or indeed an optometrist on your high street if it's an eye condition that you need sorting out? Those are the changes that you can make to the health service that actually don't require more money, but do require reprioritisation of the budget and actually cleverer working.
Does it make things harder for you when the Conservatives aren't in power in Westminster? Because it's much more difficult to point to an example of change, isn't it? If your party's in power over the border, then you can point to good practice where you believe that it lies. But when you've got two governments...
given the last 2 to 3 years of when we were in power in Westminster, I can assure you it most probably is a lot easier for my successor being in opposition and seeing the mess that Labour are making of it up there, with their broken promises when it comes to national insurance increases, broken promises when it comes to withdrawing the winter fuel payments to vulnerable pensioners. The list goes on. So I can assure you that from a devolved position, it is a lot easier being in opposition than it is in government.
Do you really believe that? Genuinely?
Well, we all want to be in government, because if you're in government, you can enact your policies. But we have to be honest and admit that we made mistakes in our last term of office. I mean, you can't go through a term and have 3 leaders, for example. I mean, that just shows shambolic control at the top. And what we have to do is recognise as Conservatives that we made mistakes, but we also did a lot of good by the country. We made sure that we stabilised the finances when we came in 2010. We ring-fenced the health budget in England, which the Labour Party didn't do in Wales, despite getting the consequentials. And that put us on the back foot, because Carwyn Jones, when he was First Minister, took a conscious decision to put more money into education and less into health. And we became the only part of the United Kingdom that cut health spending. The Labour Party actually cut health spending here in Wales. People forget about this.
Yeah, it was quite a few years ago now, wasn't it?
But that's part of... With my farming analogy, you create the seed bed to put the seed in, that it takes the year then for the seed to grow and be nurtured and harvest the crop. And we are harvesting some of that crop now in the delays and the lack of dynamism that we need to see in our health service and our education system, despite the investment that's gone in. Don't forget, Dan, in education, for example, 20% of children are leaving primary school illiterate. They're going from primary to secondary school unable to read, because the Welsh Labour government, along with their helpers in Plaid Cymru, have overseen the development of a reading literacy strategy called phonics. The queuing system that England got rid of in 2006. And ultimately, we now carry on using that when we should be using the phonics method that would get literacy levels up in our schools. Kids only get one go at education, and these clowns have ripped the future out of many people.
I mean, it's very hard, isn't it, to actually equate that figure of 20%. I mean, in reality, is it actually 20% of, do 1 in 5 children that you speak to, can they not read or write?
Well, they're not my figures. They've come from the inspectorate, and they've come from independent analysis of the research of education transition from primary to secondary schools. And ultimately, those are the figures that not a political party has put together, but have independently been put together and have not been challenged by the Welsh Government. As I said, kids get one go at education, and these clowns have been in for 26 years, and ultimately they've robbed 2 generations of a good, solid education. And I think that's unforgivable.
So let's pivot to talk about business, because of course this is the Business in Wales podcast. You yourself are a businessman. You run a farm in the Vale of Glamorgan. Talk me through the beginnings of that. It's a family farm. So when did you inherit it, and what has life been like on the farm?
Well, my father and my late mother, both sadly no longer with us, began their farming careers in the Vale of Glamorgan. Neither had much to their names. My father didn't have 2 brass farthings to rub together. He left school at the age of 14, as many did in those years, and ultimately moved from mid Wales down to the Vale of Glamorgan and ended up getting a small rented farm in a village called Bolmeston in the Vale of Glamorgan. In those days, you had big estates, and it was an estate called the Ratcliffe Estate. And they were about 7,500 acres, and the Ratcliffe Estate had made its money out of the coal business in shipping coal around the world, and based here in Cardiff. And the estate then offered opportunities to young farmers to ultimately start their farming careers. And as I said, my late mother and father ended up on a small farm, Tinnacoid Farm, in the Vale of Glamorgan, and worked up the estate ladder to another farm called the Bryn Farm in Pendoilen, and then the Garn Farm. And then the estate was left to 3 daughters who lived outside of the country, and they gave instructions to the directors of the estate to sell it in the early 60s. And that was quite a moment, that was, because all the tenants on the estate got together and formed a cooperative to buy their farms. And my father did that with the Garn Farm, and then from that, we grew through the 70s and 80s. I came into the business in the mid-80s, and my brother is with me today. And now my sons are coming into the business along with my daughters. And we hopefully are trying to build on the legacy of my late mother and father. We farm a mixed farming operation of beef and sheep. We historically used to do dairy cows and milk dairy in the Vale. But like many operations, the dairy industry is consolidated, and now not many dairy farmers exist across the UK. I think it's about 8,000 across the whole of the UK. And we also have a renewables energy business alongside it. And we also grow combinable crops, wheat, maize, oilseed occasionally, and barley as well. And all that is fed into the beef cattle and the sheep, and they go on to be sold in major retailers and local farmers markets. Tesco's, Marks and Spencer's we're accredited to sell to, Sainsbury's as well. And hopefully we're trying to do our best.
I mean, to get a bit more personal, taking the politics out of it, I mean, what pride do you get from being able to carry on your family's legacy like that?
Oh, it's vital. I mean, at the end of the day, as a family farm, you look to succeed and you drive the business forward so that you hand over to the next generation the ability to go and do something that is vocationally in you. So it's a calling almost to work the land, to care for the land and provide the food for this great country of ours. That's why the inheritance tax situation that Labour came in and changed in the last budget is so fundamentally a betrayal of a commitment made by politicians, in that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor on the stump in the general election said they had no plans to change that, and they did change it at their first opportunity. If people dispose of property, as your listeners and viewers would understand, they pay capital gains. That is right and proper, because you have disposed of something that has become more in asset value than when you purchased it, and so the difference becomes taxable. Why on earth should you suddenly be paying inheritance tax on farm businesses or businesses of any kind that ultimately are successful operations, have been built up in that person's lifetime, who has paid the tax on it, and the threat of inheritance tax will end up dismembering that business and breaking up a successful enterprise that will cease to produce food for the country and also cease to create employment opportunities in very remote and very isolated communities that, if you take tourism and agriculture away, haven't got much opportunity to create alternative employment streams.
I think most farmers would tell you that they've taken quite a kicking over the last few years from various different angles. But when it comes to inheritance tax, I think people who aren't farmers would take the view that actually this is just bringing farmers in line with what most other people have to deal with. Well, what's your response to that?
Well, there's two things to look at here. The first, if you have no sympathy for the way that the farmers find the predicament that they're in at the moment with the change in the tax legislation, is that the betrayal point. When the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and also the Prime Minister and Steve Reid, the Rural of DEFRA Secretary, said on the campaign trail they would not change inheritance tax position and agricultural property relief. There were no plans to do it. Yet within 12 weeks or so of them getting elected, they made that fundamental change. So there's that aspect on it. And then there's the second aspect of, as I said, most family farms work in remote, isolated communities that there is very little alternatives to secure business prosperity and have opportunity of employment. You have to break those businesses up to meet the tax demand that the Exchequer's placed on you, because your planning, for example, for agricultural property relief was based on the principle that it was going to stay. And ultimately, you will then end up breaking up businesses that should not be broken up because they are the backbone of those communities. So there's those two aspects that ultimately are in support of making sure that the status quo prevailed, but regrettably the government chose not to do that, and they threw the farming business and the farming community to the dogs.
I mean, the question was about the perception from the general population, people who aren't in farming, for, I guess, essentially the idea that farmers can have extremely wealthy estates, albeit not cash, it's built up in land, built up in farming equipment. Why shouldn't that be taxed in the same way that everybody else is taxed? In fact, taxed less than the way that people wanting to hand over their wealth to the next generation is.
It goes back to the point I made as well about capital gains tax. I mean, if those farms do sell, then they would be paying tax because of capital gains. But there is was a consideration given because of the extreme position that agriculture and other businesses find themselves in, to have a dispensation in the tax regime that if you plan for death through the agricultural property relief, that business could be passed on to the next generation and be farmed to provide food for the nation and secure an environment that is having investment from that business to support environmental gains that many people want to see. Food security is of paramount importance, or we're told it's of paramount importance. We're spending colossal amounts of money on defence, rightly so, but if you're spending on ships, tanks and aircraft, but you can't feed your nation, how are you going to be able to secure your future? Because if you look at the two world wars, which we just celebrated VE Day, the one win that the Germans nearly had of, and I said both wars, was the blockade of the U-boats, because we couldn't get enough food in to feed the country. And the country had rationing, as did much of Europe. And so why would a government deliberately take a policy that threatens food security? We've already gone from 75% of food security being produced in this country, that the food we can produce, down to under 60% in the last 30 years. So we become more insecure in the food that we require to feed the nation. And yet we've got a government that seems to have got a blind spot when it comes to the rural economy and the rural way of life.
Business Boyd is where food meets fire, but only the strongest will survive the heat. 6 ambitious food innovators battle it out for £5,000 and invaluable mentorship. Tasks get tougher as some of Wales's best business minds put them through their paces. Who will take the crown and who will fold under pressure? Watch the action every Wednesday at 9 p.m. on S4C, S4C Click and BBC iPlayer. Oh, this is actually an issue, going back to inheritance tax, that you've actually been reprimanded for bringing it up in the Senedd, not declaring it as an interest. I know that you very much are not hiding the fact that you're a farmer, but when you're you've got that interest and then are not declaring it, is there not perhaps I guess a bias from your perspective, or are you genuinely speaking from the position of your constituents when you bring that up?
Well, I'm speaking whenever I'm on my feet, I'm always speaking on behalf of my constituents. I mean, anyone would have seen the farming protests down in the Bay. I don't think there's many people who follow Welsh politics who don't realise I'm a farmer. I was putting a question to the minister, who has no direct responsibility for this policy. So that minister, RT Davies, could not make the change. The point I was seeking to clarify for the minister is what representations he had made on behalf of Welsh agriculture and the Welsh government to the Treasury and to his colleagues in London in relation to the inheritance tax changes or the agricultural property relief. Now, if I was asking a question of the planning minister, for example, in Cardiff Bay, which is a wholly devolved responsibility, then that minister could actually make the legislative and policy change in that particular area. I genuinely believed by merely asking an open question about what actions the government had taken to make representations to the UK government, there was no conflict of interest, because the minister I was questioning has no responsibility, has no legislative responsibility or policy responsibility on it. I'm grateful to the Standards Commissioner for clarifying the position. And obviously, I'm also chair of the Rural Affairs Committee, because it's the Economy, Trade and Rural Affairs Committee. And people will notice that at every opportunity, I make the declaration that I'm a farmer. But as I said, I don't think there's many people outside in the big bad world who don't realise that I'm not a farmer.
No, it's fair to say that you don't hide it. But, I suppose there are official declarations that can be made. And what's the reason for not doing that? Did you just forget, or?
Well, no, I just said to you, the reason was because the minister who I was asking the question did not have policy or legislative responsibility.
Yeah, but it would be a good idea to do that, wouldn't it?
Or indeed devolved competence. So I was merely seeking from the minister to find out whether he had made any representations to the UK government. I mean, you could stretch it to the point, if you've got children, should you make a declaration whenever you speak about childcare, for example, or education? Because you might be speaking to make a specific benefit to your family, for the school that they're in, to get an amount of money out of the pot to do some enhancements there. If you've got medical background, or you have a relative who has medical background, I working in the NHS, should you make the declaration? Because I'm conscious that there are quite a few Senedd members who have spouses and relatives who work in the NHS. I've never heard them once make a declaration, I haven't. But it does seem as if the Labour Party are fixated on the farming element within the Bay. And as I said, I'm grateful that the Standards Commissioner has clarified that position. But I'm not sure why you should have to make a declaration when you're questioning a minister that has no responsibility, legislative or policy-wise, over the matter you're questioning about.
Let's pivot to talking a little bit about the most recent Barn Cymru ITV poll, which I think it's fair to say sent shockwaves through Welsh politics. For the first time in, as far as I can remember, Labour very much down in the polls. Plaid Cymru seemed to be rising. From your perspective, though, seeing the Conservatives fourth and, more importantly, below Reform, how concerning was that for you?
Well, it shows how much work we've got to do. I mean, we've got a lot of work to do, and we roll up our sleeves to get out there and get the message that actually, if you want real change in Wales and you want to fix the issues that concern you and your family, it's only the Conservatives that have the solutions and have the opportunity to do that. Because don't forget, Plaid, Labour and the Liberals have been in coalition at one point or other right the way through the first 26 years of devolution. And so many of the deep-seated issues that we face within Wales are attributable to those parties of the left. And does Wales need more left-wing politics, or is it a more compassionate, focused, centre-right position that ultimately will deliver economic prosperity, reform of our public services, and ultimately the opportunity for people in Wales to get a decent wage in their pay packets, that at the moment we get the lowest take-home pay of any part of the United Kingdom that can be quantified in monetary terms of about £3,200 in everyone's pay packets, less in Wales than other parts of the United Kingdom. Can you imagine the difference that would make if you had real, meaningful change in the economic outlook of Wales that really would turbocharge the Welsh economy and put that money into people's pockets?
If you don't mind me saying, compassionate is not a word that is used to describe the Conservative Party very much. What does compassionate conservatism look like to
I
you?
would say it's, by our detractors, it's not used very much, but as a party that wants good, solid education for our young people and our children so that we're world beating in offering them the lifetime opportunities that exist in the world today, if it's having a health service that responds to your needs and your family needs rather than just chucks you on a waiting list and you wait in perpetuity and you feel as if you're just in a vortex getting nowhere, and if you want a job for you and your family that pays you a decent take-home wage that ultimately secures parity with other parts of the United Kingdom or indeed exceeds what other parts of the United Kingdom pays, that's compassion, because that is putting you at the centre of government and you driving government to deliver for you and your family.
Well, what about compassion for migrants, for people who have made Wales their home, who perhaps weren't born here? Because there's been a lot of talk about nation of sanctuary, something that you've brought up. And regardless of the politics around that, there's no doubt that Wales has a different relationship to economic migration than, say, England does at this current moment, or certainly some parts of it.
I don't necessarily see the point you're making about a different relationship to England economically.
Well, because for example, in Wales, you could argue that actually immigration is propping up a lot of the economy in terms like of the health service, for example, and even if I talk about Reform, we haven't mentioned them just yet, but even their own spokesperson in Wales made the concession that actually the arguments about immigration in England don't actually translate exactly into Welsh issues. They may resonate with the voters in the same way, but they're not actually in practice.
I think that spokesperson's gone off to France to live now.
I don't think he's with the party anymore,
no,
but yes.
Quite interesting. At the end of the day, we have a proud tradition of being an open and welcoming country, and long may that continue to a point. But to the point we've reached now where we are just being taken for a ride. We cannot continue with the illegal gangs bringing people across the channel, risking life and limb, and sadly and tragically, people have lost their lives, and the gangs are getting richer by the day. That cannot be allowed to continue. And when people are struggling to get through the basics of life because our public services are overwhelmed, we need to focus on building this country back to the needs of the people who are already here. I want to see us offering safety and security for those who have genuinely left their country for persecution, and we've had a long history of that. But what I'm not prepared as a politician to stand by and see are people exploiting the system, exploiting rules that we have the ability to change if the government is minded to do it. And we sit here today when Keir Starmer has stood up and offered another policy position on immigration. Enough is enough. We need to solve this problem because it is not in anyone's interest for it to continue.
Well, the question was about economic migration, legal migration, and you brought up illegal migration, which is almost an entirely separate issue because
it's part and parcel of the same issue. I mean, at the end of the day, the country should be able, through its politicians, to determine what is a sustainable level of migration. We have to accept that as Conservatives, we got it wrong in these areas. And I'm prepared to admit that. And we have to say sorry. But what we were doing when it came to illegal migration is making sure that we were toughening up the regime with the Rwanda scheme and ultimately putting a deterrent in place that was starting to have effect. The new Labour government in July changed the parameters of that. And now we are seeing the reaction from the Prime Minister because he realised that his arsenal and his cupboard was bare and he hasn't been able to stop that. And that feeds into the negative impression that people have over legal migration, because I hear the point you're making about illegal and legal migration, because ultimately people will leave this country to go to other countries and people will come from other countries into this country. That's international travel at the end of the day. And that is something that in any civilized society you would want to see, and to a point you would welcome. But when you have rules that allow whole families to come in, when people are only coming over here to study for a given period of time, that is not acceptable.
Business Boyd isn't just a food competition, it's a showcase of passion, personality, and pure ambition. 6 food entrepreneurs battle it out for £5,000 and mentorship that could change their lives. Each of them will take on tough challenges, pitching their ideas to some of Wales's best business minds. Who will rise to the top and who will crumble under pressure? Watch the action every Wednesday at 9 p.m. on S4C, S4C Click, and BBC iPlayer. A lot of what you say there will no doubt resonate with Reform voters. I do want to ask you, I suppose rather directly, rather bluntly, has the turquoise of Reform tickled your fancy?
I'm a Welsh Conservative at the end of the day. I've always said that. I mean, some fringe bloggers have tried to make the point that I'm off to Reform and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. I've been a Conservative all my life and I will remain a Conservative. Now, ultimately, what we have to do as Welsh Conservatives is make sure that we have a very strong offer come the Senedd elections that says to business owners, for example, that we're on your side. We want to reform the planning system. We want to reform the business rate system. We will invest in the infrastructure to get goods moving and people moving around this country of ours. And we will get the bureaucracy out of the way so that you can invest in this country. And we will have a tax system that allows you to keep the money that you earn in your pocket so that you can spend it, rather than the state dictating how much it's going to take off you in a given period.
So you've never had any talks or anything like that? I think one of your colleagues, James Evans, talked about speaking to Reform not too that long ago, I should say. You've never spoken with anyone from the party about joining?
I've never spoken to anyone about leaving the Conservatives, no. I mean, why would I?
Well, as I say, a lot of what you're saying, I think, will resonate with Reform voters.
Well, vote Welsh Conservative.
Well, that's the thing. You're not in charge of the party anymore. It's clearly a change in direction. I think that's fair to say. I think you described it as offering of a Welsh fry-up.
Full Welsh breakfast with black pudding on the side. I was offering, and then others wanted more muesli and guacamole.
For breakfast?
Well, it's up to them what they want. I wasn't prepared to have that.
Fair enough. But as I say, there's a change in direction that you're now not part of shaping as a party. Why wouldn't your head be turned?
Well, because ultimately you have beliefs. And I have the belief that the Conservative ideology of, as I said, compassionate conservatism, delivering for people to get on in life, strengthening the bonds around this country of ours, this great country of ours, and ultimately saying to people, if you want to get on, we're on your side and we'll let you get on, and that will make you, your family, and your country that much better to live, work and play in. And I believe the Welsh Conservatives have the answers when it comes to getting house building going so that we can put roofs over people's heads, whether they want to rent or buy, because that is of critical importance, because who wouldn't want their own place to call home? And the Labour government, along with their Plaid and Liberal Democrat friends, have failed miserably to do that. Why wouldn't you want an education system that has proven to deliver such appalling results that we're at the bottom of the PISA league rankings? And why would you want to put up with a health service that ultimately says, go and sit on that waiting list and we'll come back to you in 6, 12, 18 months, 2 years' time? That isn't a compassionate way to deal with people's problems and issues. That is a way to say, we've always been in control here in Wales, and we think we're going to be here in perpetuity. Well, you're not Welsh Labour, you're not Plaid Cymru, and you're not the Liberal Democrats. We as Welsh Conservatives are going to be there challenging to secure that confidence. As you say, I'm not the leader anymore, but I'm going to do all I can to make sure that in my part of the world, we get strong Welsh Conservatives back speaking on behalf of the communities they want to represent.
If you were leader still, I appreciate this is a hypothetical.
But I'm not.
But you're not, yeah, but it's a hypothetical.
I've been in politics long enough not to answer hypotheticals.
I'm going to ask it anyway. You can decide how you answer it. If you were leader, would the Welsh Conservatives be as low in the polls as they are now? Would you be performing better?
Who knows? I mean, at the end of the day, the group chose to make a decision that at Christmas time, a significant minority wanted a change of direction. I read that room and I concluded that going forward, it would be difficult to continue holding the line with that significant minority voting in the way they did. I was pleased that the majority of colleagues voted to have confidence in my leadership, but I don't know how polling would have played out as we went forward. As I said, I was offering a full Welsh fry-up with black pudding. You knew where you stood with Andrew RT Davies. I look forward to working with Darren and other colleagues to make sure that the electorate know clearly what the Welsh Conservatives are offering at the Senedd elections next year, and we capture as big a percentage of the vote as we possibly can to make that change that I believe Wales desperately needs.
Do you hold any resentment over the changing of the breakfast?
Good God, no. Life is too short. Life is far too short. Never worry about what's happened in the past. Always look to the future. Learn the lessons from what's happened in the past, but don't carry the grudge into the future, because ultimately it'll eat you rather than eat others.
Because what does the breakfast analogy actually represent? That I guess a full English has been the same for as long
Welsh,
as we can remember it.
Welsh.
Oh, full Welsh, I should say, has been the same as long as we can remember it, including black pudding, of course. But where does the granola get into this? It's a little bit of a confusing analogy for people who aren't in the know.
And actually, a lot of people have said how clear-cut that analogy was.
Well, explain it to me. Explain it to me.
Pundit to say to me that it's confusing. I mean, that is, in today's world, because the electoral system is changing, people need to know exactly what you stand for, because you're not voting today for an individual so much in the new voting system we've got. On the ballot paper, there will be the party brand.
Yes. Yeah.
And to me, you made the analogy there, the Welsh breakfast with the black pudding on the side is something that people understand what's on the plate, they know what's on the offer, and we should be making that clear, unashamedly Welsh Conservative offer to the electorate, so that when they're looking at their ballot paper, they see Welsh Conservative and they put a cross against it, rather than the mix that potentially any party could have of the point that I made about the alternative.
So people don't understand granola is the point.
Well, it depends what they want to think about the granola.
Has your relationship with Darren changed? I mean, clearly it has, because you're not working together in the shadow cabinet, but, you know, as he's your successor, do you give him advice still? Do you talk about what it's like
Darren
to...
and myself get on like a house on fire. I mean, At the end of the day, he was my chief whip and business manager. And I am doing all I can and will continue to do all I can to make sure that Darren has a romping result in 2026 and achieves what we all want to achieve, Welsh Conservatives in government. I want to see that. Darren wants to see that. And I'm sure every member of his shadow cabinet team want to see that. And I will do all I can from my humble position these days to secure that come 2026.
So what do the Welsh Conservatives need to do then between now and May of next year? Because clearly, I guess you could say that the current strategy isn't working.
Well, it's not for me to offer running commentary on the current strategy. That'll be for you to get one of the shadow cabinet members in or the leader himself. I have said in our interview what I stand for and what I believe in. And,
No, but you know,
no, but I know if I answer that question, then it'll be Andrew RT Davies says this.
Yeah, but
So I'm not going there, Dan.
It's a very good question because you know
it's a good question for you, Dan.
You know better than most how these strategies get put together, and you can definitely be, as somebody from the outside looking in, can say I would do this differently, I would do that differently. So that's why
I'll keep that counsel to myself and to the meetings that we have, because obviously as a group we are a unified group that ultimately has collective responsibility. But I am never slow at coming forward in the way I think that we should be doing things, and I will give that advice if it's sought to make sure that people know exactly where I stand.
Well, we'll say this time next year then we can talk about how that strategy played out and whether you would have changed things along the way. How does that sound?
I'd be always happy to come back and have another chat in 12 months' time.
Fantastic. Well, Andrew RT Davies, thank you so much for your time. We like to end these podcasts, and it may seem a little strange at Hard Pivot because I end these shows by asking people if you could give a bit of advice to your younger self, what would it be? As I say, a bit strange considering we've covered a lot of bases, but a bit of a left field question.
Never give up and never, ever let anyone push you down. Because ultimately, you're your own master, your own controller of your own destiny, and have that confidence to go forward and do whatever it is that you want to do. And if you fall over, pick yourself back up, dust yourself off, and get on with the job in hand.
I think that's a nice way to end it. Andrew, thank you so much for your time.
Lovely job. Cheers, Dan. Thank you.
Pleasure. The Business in Wales podcast, the business media for Wales.